Everyone. I would like to welcome you to our third Occupational Therapy Month webinar here at Gowan Consulting. Before we get started, if you'd like to just include in the chat where you are located and perhaps what your role is, just to let us know who's joining us today. And just as a reminder for everyone that we are recording the session, so feel free if you would like to have your camera on or camera off, you can choose what you would like to do for that. I will be taking a look towards the end in case if there are any questions in the chat. As well, at that point, if you would like to unmute and ask a question, you can go ahead. I'm just letting you know that perhaps I may not see your question until we get to that point. So if you'd like to just hold on and we can check in then. So welcome everybody. Today we will be talking about neurodiversity in the workplace. So just a little bit about us as Gowan Consulting. We are a private business in business for 23 years, and we service Canada-wide. We are an occupational therapy business providing occupational therapy services in a number of different So we mainly focus on the functional ability of the person and in the work environment. So some of our services include things like ergonomics, accommodation, stay at work, return to work, mental health support, training, policy development, and other educational workshops. So for today's topic, we are going to be talking about neurodiversity. So I'd like you just to take a look at this slide here and notice, there may be some recognizable figures for you, and just understanding that there may be some things that these different people have in common. So we are all different. People experience and interact with the world around them in many ways. So there's no real right way of thinking or learning and behaving. And in our differences, we can have innovation, creative ideas, and new ways of understanding the world and the work that we do. Sometimes biases that likely stem from a lack of awareness about where neurodiversity is and how it manifests in the workplace and the types of conditions that a person may experience that are considered to be neurodivergent might impact the way we think or approach our interactions with those individuals. Oftentimes, biases likely stem from our lack of awareness or perhaps previous experience that we have had with an individual, and that may not be the case for all individuals that we interact with. So firstly, we're going to look a little bit at defining neurodiversity. So what are we talking about when we say neurodiversity? This refers to the diversity of all people. So it can include people that have differences as well as the diversity of all people in the way that our brain works or the ways that we think and function. It can also include conditions such as conditions across the autism spectrum, ADHD, learning differences, other neurological conditions. So could be something like dyslexia or dyspraxia you may have heard of, various mental health conditions, brain injuries, or developmental conditions. It's estimated that about 30 to 40% of the population would fit into the category of what we would consider neurodivergent. And if you think back to me just mentioning those different types of conditions, you can see that really it's not a heterogeneous group. And even within the same diagnosis, we see that people are not a heterogeneous group. So this is just to give you a little bit more information about some of the other conditions that may fall under the category of neurodivergent conditions. So again, we mentioned autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, Down syndrome, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyslexia, intellectual disabilities, traumatic brain injury or stroke, a brain hemorrhage, dyspraxias, mental health conditions, sensory disorders, social anxiety, and many more. So neurodiversity really is inclusive of all different ways of processing information and communicating regardless of the acquired or congenital condition. Oftentimes, many of these conditions can be considered non-apparent. So meaning that it's not externally obvious. And you may have come across various terms to describe this in the past, but this non-apparent, this is a much better term than some previously used terms such as hidden or invisible disabilities, because those terms are less invalidating of the internal experience of the individual. So thinking back, that all brains work differently. And neurodivergence does not mean that there is an intellectual delay per se, but rather that there is a different way of taking in, processing, and translating the information from our environment. Additionally, we can see that for people with neurodivergent conditions, that there can be a co-occurrence of other conditions, such as mental health conditions. So that we see that there is an increased occurrence of the following mental health conditions for individuals that are neurodivergent. So often we will see things like anxiety disorders, gender dysphoria, mood disorders, OCD, personality disorders, schizophrenia, or substance use disorders. Attention deficit and disorder is often associated with things like anxiety, mood disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, personality disorders. And we see with individuals often with autism spectrum disorder having some associations with different types of anxiety, eating disorders, gender dysphoria, mood disorders, OCD, as well as several others. Now I'm going to play for you a video. Let's see if we can get this up for you.
If a person were to say to me, wow, you're really good at thinking about concepts, for example, the equivalent of that for me would be to say to a person, wow, you're really good at breathing.
People think that you're thick.
They think that I can't read.
That we're dumb, that we're slow, we're uneducable. Actually, it's quite the opposite.
I'm neurodiverse because I am autistic.
I have something that's called Asperger's syndrome, which is an autistic spectrum disorder.
I'm dyslexic.
I have Asperger's syndrome.
I'm dyslexic and I also have dysgraphia.
I have dyslexia and dyscalculia.
I got an ADHD diagnosis a few years ago, and it was actually the first time in my life that I made sense to myself.
I just think it's the way my brain's wired up.
Just wired differently.
I am not seeing what everyone else is seeing. There's obviously a huge advantage to that, but we've only learned to appreciate this potential over the last few years.
One way of understanding neurodiversity is if we've got people who we call normal, we call them neurotypical, they can see the visual spectrum of colours going from red to indigo. Neurodiverse people, they might not be able to see blue, but they can see in infrared. Now you've got somebody in your team who can see in the dark. Do you want to have that person in your team? Of course you do.
Many of my strengths, I believe, come from my autism.
I'm good at retaining knowledge. I know where to find the knowledge.
My brain is incredibly logical.
Recording in
One of my
progress.
main traits is I can take lots of different sort of level 2D drawings and then make them into a 3D model in my head and be able to spin them around.
I'm very good at spatial things. I built a kitchen in our house 12 years ago, bought all the bits from IKEA and fitted the whole thing. And somebody said to me, well, where did you make a plan that? I didn't. I did it all in my head.
So ADHD is basically like watching 30 different channels at the same time and somebody else is holding the remote control. I am calm in situations where a lot of other people get really anxious. There's limited fear to actually make a decision, which I sometimes find very helpful in a business context, because sometimes we just have to decide something to be able to move ahead.
I can hold very large, very complex systems in mind.
The way I look at the world is black and white. It's not the grey areas in between. I can think logically, I can think straight down the middle, and it brings the team in together so that it's not going round and round in circles.
I think one of the biggest challenges for me is that neurological differences are invisible. Don't assume everyone else, just because they look like you or they have a similar job or that they think in the exact same way.
I would say definitely don't be afraid to talk about it.
For me, I would say speak to your managers and let them be aware. And I think by doing that, it makes you more confident and more free.
It's not something that all of us are easy talking about, but the more we do talk about it, the more people understand and will appreciate the different abilities and the different gifts that neurodivergent people can actually bring to HSBC.
Right. So there can be advantages, as we did see in the last video, around some of the strengths that people with neurodiverse or neurodivergent conditions could have. So some of the things that we often see for these clients could be things like boosts to company morale, more diverse perspectives, improved retention, better management, and above average skills and talents in some categories. So really, all workplaces are already neurodiverse, but some workplaces recognize and celebrate the differences openly and increase the psychological safety for individuals who do disclose their own neurodivergent experiences. This can boost company culture and morale by incorporating more awareness training for neurodiversity in the workplace. Coworkers and managers may become more accepting of differences in personality, communication, and working styles, and come to understand the differences that are actually an asset. So in this way, it's creating a culture of inclusivity, and that allows all employees to bring their authentic selves to work and feel more engaged and satisfied in their jobs. Diverse perspectives are essential for innovation and growth, and teams that are diverse can use their members' unique experiences and perspectives to find creative solutions to complex problems. This can also help to foster retention, because when employees feel valued and supported by their employer, they're more likely to stay at that company. As labor shortages are at an all-time high, and Canadian companies are struggling to recruit and retain skilled talent, implementing policies that recruit and support neurodivergent individuals can help to fill and avoid skills gaps. So things like improving manager-employee relationships, having neurodiversity training amongst your leadership team is beneficial because it can improve the manager-employee relationship, not just for the neurodivergent worker, but also for all employees. More empathetic and understanding towards the employee can be fostered to help meet their needs. And this empathy and understanding usually will extend to neurotypical workers as well. By leveraging their above average skills and talents, neurodiversity inclusion is beneficial because of those above average skills that many neurodivergent workers bring to the workforce can help support your team with that creativity and innovation. So we'll look at the OT role. So as occupational therapists, we look at the person's function. What are they able to do in the context of their environment and the tasks or occupations that they need to or want to do? As occupational therapists, we look at and consider the whole person, including their strengths, to help them meet their work demands. A number of different ways of assessing these things. So how do we determine the supports that the worker may need and or what are their strengths? So how we may do this might be through clinical interview. So we may be doing some interview with the worker themselves, and we may be using some specific questions. For example, if we're working with a client with ADHD, there may be some specific considerations that we would have for the types of questions we would ask. And similarly, for other types of neurodivergent conditions, we may have some special questions that we may ask of those individuals, knowing what their condition may involve. We might also use some psychosocial questionnaires with them. Again, if we're working with an ADHD person, we may use some specific questionnaires related to that condition and or the condition that this client has identified to us to help try to target some specific aspects that might be involved with their known condition or disorder to help us narrow down some areas that they may need support or may have some challenges, as well as where some areas of strengths might be. Additionally, we like to collect some collateral information. So to help us get a more broad perspective of that environmental view, as I had mentioned earlier. So what is involved for the worker and around them? We may be asking to do an interview with the manager or referral source to gather more information about how someone else is seeing the challenges for their worker or the strengths for the worker. We might ask other stakeholders that may be involved. So perhaps for this worker, it's helpful to have an understanding of their past work performance, or maybe speaking with a past manager or coworker. We may be looking at some information around previous performance appraisal documents or feedback, even from post-secondary education. Or we may also be talking to their family. So what are some of the challenges that their family members have been noticing, perhaps in the home environment or interactions with this person, that could help inform our approach with them in supporting them? One area that we often look at is the person's cognition. So their function that they are able to do with their thinking. So these are just a few examples of some functional cognitive assessment tools that we may use. What we're trying to look at is this person's ability with their cognitive function kind of in action. So how does that display functionally. And when we're looking at the person and perhaps using these tools, we may be looking at a number of different components or areas of cognitive function. So we might be looking at things like their memory or their skills around attention, how quickly they process information, their ability to problem solve or plan, verbal reasoning skills, a number of different areas that we might look at. Along with doing some standardized tests and questionnaires and interviews with the person, we want to be able to also take a look at what they are able to do on the job. So how do they really approach their job? Are we able to observe some of the areas that maybe they're having challenges? And that helps us to gather some information about some of the recommendations or strategies that we might want to target for this person. So the types of things that we're looking at with our observation of their job tasks are really to take a look at their essential tasks. So are there some key parts of their job? What are the main things that they are doing during the day, during the week, or perhaps there are some things that are seasonally important to their work? We're trying to get a sense of what is their work routine. So oftentimes we'll be asking them to let us know about what does their daily routine look like at work. What types of things do they do perhaps when they first arrive at work at the start of the day? Is part of their process to look at their emails and then determine what their priorities are for the day? Do they have another approach to that? And are any of those parts of their routine or processes impacting the way they do their work or their productivity? And we may observe multiple tasks, but we oftentimes will specifically try to target to be able to observe tasks that they have identified as challenging. One area that we often see is that clients may have challenges around planning or organizing. Perhaps they feel overwhelmed. Do they have repetitive tasks in their role that we can observe them completing a few times to help target where are these challenges that they're experiencing? Where does this overwhelm set in? So what are some common challenges that we might see? And to keep in mind that we're not stereotyping according to characteristics. So knowing that some conditions do have some common traits or common presentations does not mean that we will see that the same with every individual with that condition, but it is helpful for us to be aware of those common traits. One area of challenge often can be around miscommunication. What we often see is that neurodivergent communication can often look like logical, no sarcasm, blunt and direct in language, literal interpretations, and don't understand how things may hurt someone's feelings. Now, keep in mind, as I had said previously, that this does not mean that this is true for all individuals who have a certain condition, and nor does it mean that it is true for every type of neurodivergent condition either. Okay. So ways to overcome these challenges. Trying to avoid sarcasm in your communication approaches can be really helpful for individuals to clearly understand the messages that you're trying to get across. So really saying what you mean. Trying not to be vague and beat around the bush and expect the listener to try to interpret your message. Instead, you want to be clear. So break it down into clear, precise language. And you may need to do some communication around challenges that you have had in a past communication. So for example, this situation, this hurt because. So you're explaining about what had happened in the past, and how can we both adjust our communication towards each other so that it's more clear as well as respectful. So again, some communication differences that may arise is that some individuals may require clear multi-step instructions at once. And knowing that you may need to provide multi-step instructions is keeping in mind that you may need to break it down in some way or present a few points at a time and allow some time for processing that information. Some individuals may need you to regularly repeat some of the information. Others may do well with broad asks, so giving them a much more broad request and then breaking them down into multi-step activities themselves. Sometimes it can just be very simple, small tweaks to our communication that can be the solution. So behavior. Sometimes for some individuals, their behavior can be perceived as inappropriate. So perhaps they may appear as being challenging or over questioning, or even sometimes we have had where the clients have been experienced, their interactions have been experienced as being insubordinate. So ways to overcome this. So thinking about why the person may be acting in this way. Having a clear conversation. Perhaps it's just clarifying when you said this or did this, was this your intention? And having an honest, kind communication about it that's not punitive in any way, just trying to find some clarification for each other and making sure that we can have our communications work for each other a little bit better in the future. So for example, are you aware that this might be inappropriate or that this hurts someone? So perhaps this person was having challenges to be able to identify that that approach was maybe not the best approach. Others may have interpreted it differently. So spending some time with each other, discussing what can be some of those clear and kind communication approaches can sometimes be helpful. So a coaching tip would just be, you should avoid XYZ in the future. So sometimes we can experience challenges, or these clients can experience challenges with misinterpretation of the processes. So some considerations might be around how you give feedback during the hiring processes and during interviewing. So some ways to overcome challenges with this misinterpretation of process is to really explain the process or have information available to the person to be able to look at what is the process involved and have some time to look at that for themselves, to allow them to have some processing time. Clearly explaining the expectations. So making sure that you really have clearly defined what's expected here. Sometimes we will hear, I did explain it to them, and this is what I said. And then when we spend some time dissecting that, we really see that it wasn't quite clear. Perhaps it was clear to the mind of the person who is explaining it because they have a different context, a different lens that they're coming to the information that they're sharing. They have some already background knowledge on the information that they're sharing. And the person that they're communicating to does not have that same perspective or lens. And so the information shared really is not clearly explained, or the expectations are not really clear. And then just being forgiving and patient of each other. Sometimes we will have miscommunications, and it's just for both parties involved to identify, I think I'm missing some information here. It wasn't so clear, and forgiving that person for not clearly communicating. And conversely, if the other person did not quite understand, being forgiving and patient to then clearly explain it and identify the information that was missed, as opposed to feeling frustrated and getting angry with the person right away. Let's start first with forgiving and being patient and trying to resolve the issue. Diverse, inclusive environment, and providing feedback that is clear when you're going through hiring and interviewing processes, then thinking about approaches that may need to be slightly different. Are there different types of questions that I may need to ask? Might I need to ask them in a responses that I'm looking for from all candidates, as well as considering and welcoming strengths. So how do my processes, either with feedback or in hiring or interviewing, how do they really highlight the strengths of the person? And am I asking the right questions to get to those? Individuals who are neurodivergent can also experience sensory issues. So some areas that might impact their focus or attention at work could be things like the lights feeling too bright, or having some challenges focusing on the tasks at hand, environmental distractions. There can be many things that can relate to. So is it the noise in the office? Is it perhaps all the Post-it notes that they have on their desk around the computer? Are there things that we can change or can't change? And how are we going to get around those challenges? So there can be some simple ways that we can try to overcome some of the frequently seen challenges in the environment that might be impacting a person if they are experiencing sensory issues. So it could be, for example, wearing shades, or it may be adjusting the mode on their screen. So perhaps they're going to operate in a dark mode screen, or they may be having a specific app to help alleviate some of the visual strain, or they may have some special technology, screen shade, that type of thing. For noise in the environment, sometimes we may have individuals using headsets. So perhaps they need to use a headset for calls during their workday, but perhaps they're also using them for noise dampening or noise canceling, so that maybe they have a headset that can do both for them. Earbuds or other types of earplugs that may help them to lower the volume of environmental noise, but still allow them to interact in their environment. If, for example, a colleague comes to talk to them in their office or something like that, they'd be able to still hear. Sometimes using music, so to help as a bit of drowning out some of that environmental noise. Perhaps they may be moved to a quieter environment, things like that. So when we're looking at their cognition, some things that we may be looking at are the person's ability around organizing, planning, sequencing. Perhaps we're seeing individuals that experience very literal thinking. So what do we do? How do we look at that to try to help overcome some of those challenges? So some of the suggestions that you might see for these workers may be looking at breaking down things into steps, providing some support for planning, making some recommendations or reviewing some different strategies around product management, supporting their ability to think differently. So perhaps they've always tackled a problem with a certain approach, or often have fallen to similar types of solutions. And perhaps these tasks or requirements for them require a different approach that they don't have a lot of practice in, or perhaps they're not pulling up naturally. So we might look at ways to approach things differently and help them, support them in that different thinking and building those skills that they need in that area. We might be using memory tools or strategies, and we may be giving some support around literal thinking versus abstract thinking. change. So we all know that one of the only constants is really that change is always happening, right? So for many neurodivergent individuals, frequent change may introduce stress and anxiety, and may be an additional challenge for them for dealing with these organizational changes. As well, a change in leadership might also introduce challenges if the new managers are not trained effectively to lead their neurodiverse team. Sometimes we will see as well where some strategies and supports and plans have been put in place for the worker, and some of that history or knowledge information has been lost with that transition. So making sure that those types of plans are clearly communicated to new team members that are coming on. So a new manager or leader coming on that will be supporting that worker or workers, that they have a clear understanding of some of the supports that have been put in place and why. Some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself is what happens when there is a manager change? So just kind of considering some of those processes and planning that might need to take place. What happens if an employee changes teams? So have they been kind of acting like the scaffolding to supporting other workers? And what happens when an employee wants to change teams? We want to be proactive about communicating the change. We want to work with the employee to create a plan. So if this is someone that does need that type of support, to have a plan, respecting the preferences of the employee regarding disclosure to a new team member or manager. And then encouraging the employees and managers to reach out and work with their HR team or other supports that they may have in the organization to help deal with changes. Using job coaches when we know changes are expected. Perhaps we want to have the support of a mentor or buddy to our neurodivergent workers and as well as all workers. So mentors, work buddies, or trusted peers who make the effort to understand the individual and provide that long-term commitment that can help them feel more empowered. Just going to let you know that we do have some upcoming events. We have a virtual hybrid ergonomics training coming up. Actually, that's been part of it is happening today. We have neurodiversity in the workplace coming up on December 5th. So if you would like more information about what we have been talking about today and going a little bit more in depth, really today we're just kind of scratching the surface. That may be something that's of interest to you as well. We have cognitive demands analysis certificate training that will be coming up in January. Later in our OT month webinar series, so part 4, we have next week coming up the OT role in ergonomics. Just going to stop sharing for the moment just to see if we do have some questions coming up in the chat, or feel free if you did have a question to go ahead and unmute while I just take a quick scan of our chat here. Don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to pull this back up for us here. So just to share as well that Gowan Consulting is a finalist for the Weeby Supplier of the Year at the 2023 National Conference.
Kelly, there is a someone in the chat that just asked a question from just posted now.
Great.
I think it's Daniel.
Yes, I see that there. Thank you so much, Antonella. Struggles in there.
I can clarify if you want. I was trying to get it in there before you moved on.
Yeah, no, I can understand your question. No problem there.
Perfect.
So Daniel is just asking about the struggles that neurodiverse people might take home with them because of masking and altering themselves throughout the work day. So I'm just going to scroll here so I can see this better. Yes, so that can be a challenge. If workers are masking quite a bit at work, then they may experience, exhaustion or fatigue from doing that throughout the day. There is potential for challenges around feeling fulfilled at work. So being able to feel like you can be yourself in the work environment, feeling like you can share all of your strengths. Sometimes there can be strengths that neurodivergent people can experience that in some situations people actually interpret that as not a strength. And so sometimes that can be a challenge where perhaps you have a real strength in creativity, but your work environment is not really one that lends well to sharing or really fully growing in your creativity capacity. So sometimes that can be a challenge and a conflict for the person and can impact their morale and their satisfaction at work. And then what can happen as well is because people are feeling that way or overloaded, then we can see that trickle into their home life where perhaps they're experiencing additional fatigue. So they may limit participation in other things in the home environment. So maybe they're not socializing as much outside of work because they're fatigued from interacting with people all day, or perhaps they're just really drained, so they don't want to participate in some of their favorite activities outside of work because they just really need that recovery time. Or sometimes the stress and strain, and so they are responding and having a harder time with emotional regulation. So maybe they're more frustrated with family members or friends, or have challenges with getting to home tasks, right? It can oftentimes we'll hear from people challenges around cleaning or organizing in the home environment, challenges with really completing other tasks that they find challenging to begin with, but now because this feeling of being drained, it makes it that much harder for them. I do see another question here. So Daniel, I hope that answered your question. I do see another question here about the cognitive demands analysis certificate. We don't have the specific dates yet, but I believe we're looking at towards the middle end of January timeframe.
I have a bit of a follow-up if we have time
Sure.
for it. This might just because I'm also neurodivergent. I'm kind of going through this of like the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the whole the strengths that we can bring to the workplace, and there's this conversation about like this, my neurodiversity is kind of my superpower, but it kind of my perspective on it was that it over enhances kind of the ability that you perform at work, and then you take home those struggles to your home life. So superstar at work, awesome work, great worker, but you go home and it's now a struggle. And I'm wondering if there's a balance that we can that's recommended to managers to help encourage those awesome skills that neurodivergent people tend to have, while also respecting the fact that by encouraging these skills, recognizing that it does place an extra burden in the home life that neurotypical people wouldn't normally go home with.
Yeah. And so, often for us, when we as occupational therapists are working with those individuals, we are looking at the whole person. So like I mentioned before, we are looking at their work environment and their work tasks, but we're also looking at the way things are impacting them outside of work and challenges that they may be having outside of work. So sometimes the tasks or occupations that we're engaged in outside of work, where we're having challenges, that could influence or impact our work in some way. So if you're having a really hard time keeping organized or missing health appointments, things like that, could it impact us at work? And vice versa, our work impacting our home life. So from an individual perspective, we might look at all those pieces together and see, how can we shift things in the work environment and home environment to help support the overall picture of what they're trying to accomplish. From a manager's perspective, then yes, sometimes we may, if we're doing more of a team education, manager education, inclusivity training, that type of thing, looking at, what are those pieces that we can consider that that would be beneficial for this specific worker, but also might be helpful for the rest of the team. And just looking at the way that work is organized or how the worker has control over that work being organized. And perhaps there are some planning strategies, where we can look at the way that their workload plays out or how they organize things, or even sometimes shortcuts and things that we can help set up so that they are not having that as much impact. So they are really thriving with, like you said, maybe they have a superstar skill in one area, so that they can still thrive with that, but also have those opportunities for recovery throughout the work day so that it's not having as much of that impact into their home life.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the answer.
I would add that accommodations, I just see a comment here from Shani, that accommodations can play a big role, so such as breaks throughout the day and rest to recover. Yes, so that's what I was kind of talking about, looking at the work day and, are there opportunities for just the way that things are planned or tackled a little bit differently to allow those recovery and rest. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the worker is going to need to take an extra break per se, but it might just be that the way that they organize their approach to their daily tasks can be slightly different so that they have kind of a recovery period. So maybe they're doing something different that's not as overloading for them and their own strengths. And then they're moving on to those more challenging areas, etc. Okay, I'm just going to see. I don't think we have any other questions, but if someone else has a question, feel free to unmute or add your question to the chat. I think we're just coming to the end here. So if you have to go, that's fine. I'm just going to